The studio lights blazed down on the set of Global News Network, GNN, in New York City, casting sharp shadows across the sleek, modern stage. It was March 8th, 2023, a primetime slot that promised fireworks, and the air crackled with anticipation. Over 10 million viewers had tuned in, some sprawled on couches across America, others streaming live on their phones, eager to witness what GNN's promos had billed as the interview of the year. The audience in the room, a mix of curious onlookers and die-hard fans, fidgeted in their seats, their murmurs rising like static before a storm. At the center of it all stood Jessica Hart, the network's golden child, her auburn hair perfectly styled, her navy blazer crisp against the spotlight. At 38, she'd built a reputation as a liberal firebrand, infamous for her gotcha moments that left conservative guests scrambling. Tonight, she wore her signature smile, practiced, polished, the kind that hit a dagger. Across from her sat Donald Trump, the 76-year-old former president, real estate mogul, and perennial lightning rod. He leaned back in the plush guest chair, his navy suit impeccable, his tie a bold red slash against a white shirt. His hands rested casually on the armrests, but his eyes sharp, unblinking, scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield. The crowd hushed as the countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The red on-air sign flared to life, and Jessica's smile widened, her teeth gleaming under the lights. She'd spent weeks with her team crafting this ambush, a barrage of questions designed to pierce Trump's armor, targeting his marriage to Melania, a chink, she believed, in his carefully curated family values persona. This was her moment to shine, to cement her legacy as the journalist who took down the untouchable. "Good evening, America," Jessica began, her voice smooth as velvet. "Tonight, we're joined by a man who needs no introduction. Donald Trump, business titan, former president, a figure who shaped our nation for decades. Mr. Trump, welcome." She paused, letting the applause ripple through the studio, her gaze locked on him like a predator sizing up prey. Trump nodded, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, as if he'd seen this play before and knew the script by heart. "Let's start simple," she continued, leaning forward just enough to signal warmth, a trap wrapped in friendliness. "You've built an empire, won the White House, influenced millions around the world. Some might call it an incredible run. Tell me, Mr. Trump, would you say you're just lucky?" The question landed softly, a velvet glove over an iron fist, meant to draw him in before the real blows came. Jessica's team had rehearsed this. Start light, lure him into boasting, then twist the knife with something personal. She expected deflection, maybe a rambling brag, anything she could spin. Trump tilted his head, his expression a mix of amusement and steel. "Lucky?" he echoed, his voice steady, cutting through the hum of the studio. "You know, Jessica, it's interesting you'd use that word. The liberals love it. Lucky. They throw it around to diminish what people build, to pretend hard work and sacrifice don't count. But let me tell you something, luck doesn't pour concrete for skyscrapers. Luck doesn't create thousands of jobs. And luck sure as hell doesn't make America great." He leaned forward slightly, his hand gesturing with that familiar, commanding flair. "I've been blessed, sure, but I've worked harder than most can even dream. That's not luck. That's Trump." Jessica's smile tightened, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. This wasn't the defensive stumble she banked on. The audience murmured, some nodding, others leaning in. She adjusted her notes, her mind racing. The game was on, and Trump was already rewriting the rules. The studio lights seemed to burn a little brighter as Jessica Hart recalibrated, her fingers brushing the edge of her note cards. Trump's opening salvo had thrown her off script. He hadn't stumbled into the trap of self-aggrandizement she'd expected. Instead, he turned her softball question into a sermon on work ethic, and the audience's murmurs told her she'd underestimated his footing. She tilted her head, her smile stretching wider to mask the flicker of unease. Fair enough, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice honeyed but sharp. You've made it clear luck isn't the whole story. You said you've worked harder than most can dream impressive. But you also said something else that caught my ear. You didn't do it alone. Let's talk about that. Who's behind Donald Trump? The question hung in the air, a deliberate pivot from business to personal. The first step toward the minefield she'd spent weeks plotting with her team. Backstage, Peter, her wiry assistant producer, adjusted his headset and whispered into the mic. Perfect. Jess, reel him in slow. Jessica's eyes flicked briefly to the control booth, then back to Trump, her posture casual but coiled. She wanted him to name names, business partners, advisors, anything she could twist into a segue about Melania, the quiet first lady she'd pegged as his Achilles heel. Her plan was simple. Paint Melania as a passive figure, a trophy wife whose silence undermined Trump's family values rhetoric. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Trump's smirk widened, his hands spreading in a gesture that filled the stage. Who's behind me? That's a great question. Jessica, really great. You're probably thinking about my business partners, right? The brilliant minds at Trump Organization, my advisors who help me turn deals into gold. And they're fantastic, believe me, top people. But if you want the real answer, the one that matters most, it's my family, especially Melania. He paused, letting the name settle, his tone softening but firm, like a man staking a claim. She's the rock, the heart of it all. Always has been. Jessica's eyebrows arched, a predator catching the scent of opportunity. Melania, she echoed, her voice dripping with feigned curiosity. Fascinating choice. You know, Mr. Trump, a lot of people wonder about her role in all this. She's rather quiet, isn't she? For the wife of such a powerful, outspoken man? We hear from you all the time on Twitter, at rallies, but Melania stays in the background. Don't you think the public deserves to know more about the woman behind Donald Trump? The question was laced with a subtle jab, her smile tightening as she leaned in, expecting him to flinch. Trump's eyes narrowed, but his posture didn't budge an oak against a breeze. The public knows exactly what they need to know about Melania, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the studio's hum. She's brilliant, speaks 5 languages. Did you know that? 5. Most people can't manage 2. She's built her own career, modeled in Europe, succeeded long before she met me. And as First Lady, she represented this country with grace, dignity more than most in recent memory. But quiet? No, I'd say dignified. There's a difference. Jessica, big difference. I get why some in the media might not grasp that. You folks love noise, filling every silence with chatter. Melania picks her moments. That's strength. A nervous titter rippled through the audience, a few clapping softly. Jessica's smile faltered for a split second, her fingers tightening on her cards. This wasn't the defensive dodge she'd anticipated. Trump wasn't retreating. He was advancing. Backstage, Peter hissed into the headset. Push harder. Jess, she's the angle. Don't let him steer this. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her composure snapping back like a taut wire. Strength, interesting word, she said, her tone shifting to something sharper, more insistent. But let's talk about that dignity, that success. You've achieved so much, Mr. Trump. No one's denying your drive. But surely you'd agree your position, your wealth, your name, it's opened doors for Melania, hasn't it? Some say her biggest accomplishment is becoming Mrs. Donald Trump. Is that fair to her, or to the narrative you've built around family values? The studio air thickened, the audience hushing as the question landed. It was a calculated strike implying Melania's worth was tied to Trump's shadow, a challenge to his pride and principles. Peter grinned behind the glass, whispering, "Got him now." But Trump's smirk didn't fade. He leaned forward slightly, his hands steepling, his gaze locking onto Jessica like a hawk spotting prey. Open doors? He repeated, his voice gaining intensity. "You're about to find out what Melania does with doors, Jessica, and it's not what you think." The crowd stirred, sensing the storm brewing, while Jessica braced herself, unaware she'd just handed him the reins. The Global News Network studio pulsed with tension as Jessica Hart's latest question lingered in the air like smoke after a gunshot. "Some say her biggest accomplishment is becoming Mrs. Donald Trump," she'd said, her voice edged with a smugness she couldn't quite conceal. The audience held its breath, a collective inhale that sucked the oxygen from the room. A few jeers erupted from the back, quickly drowned by the rustle of anticipation. Jessica leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the certainty of a hunter closing in on wounded prey. She'd struck at Melania's role, baiting Trump to either puff up his ego or falter in defense. Either way, she'd have her viral clip. Backstage, Peter pumped a fist, his voice crackling through her earpiece. "Nail him, Jess. This is it." Trump didn't flinch. He sat still for a beat, his hands resting lightly on the chair's arms, his face a mask of calm that unsettled the room. Then, a low chuckle rumbled from his chest, not warm but sharp, like the sound of a blade being unsheathed. "Open doors, huh?" he said, repeating her earlier jab, his tone deceptively light. "You think Melania is some kind of passenger in my story? Let me set the record straight since you're so interested in facts." He leaned forward now, his elbows on his knees, his gaze boring into Jessica with an intensity that made her shift in her seat. The smirk was gone, replaced by a steely resolve that filled the stage. "Melania doesn't just walk through doors," he began, his voice rising with a controlled power that silenced the crowd. "She kicks them down, 5 languages fluent. French, Italian, German. You name it, most people in this room couldn't handle one. She built a career in Europe, modeling, succeeding, long before I ever met her. She didn't need my name. She had her own. And when she became First Lady, she didn't just sit there smiling for cameras. She worked quietly, sure, but with more impact than the loudmouths who think shouting equals strength. Be best? Her initiative? That touched kids, parents, millions real results, not hot air. You wouldn't know that, Jessica, because your network's too busy spinning tailies to notice." The audience stirred, a wave of murmurs swelling into scattered applause. Jessica's smile stiffened, her fingers clutching her note cards like a lifeline. She opened her mouth to interject, but Trump barreled on, his voice gaining momentum. "You say her biggest accomplishment is being Mrs. Trump. That's your angle? Let me tell you something, being my wife isn't a trophy, it's a partnership. She stood by me through storms most people couldn't imagine, attacks, lies, 24/7 scrutiny. She's tougher than half the politicians I've met, and smarter than most of the pundits on your payroll. But you don't see that, do you? You see a quiet woman and think weak. That's your mistake." Peter's voice buzzed in her ear. "Pivot, Jess, hit him harder." She nodded faintly, her composure fraying but her resolve hardening. "That's a passionate defense, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone sharpening, "and no one's questioning Melania's resilience. But let's be real. You're a powerful man, wealthy, famous, connected. You could have anyone. Yet here you are, with someone who's been by your side for years, getting older alongside you. Don't you ever think about trading up?" The words dropped like a bombshell, raw and unfiltered, stripping away the last veneer of civility. Gasps rippled through the audience, a woman in the front row covering her mouth, a man in a red cap shouting, "Disgraceful!" The studio air turned electric, every eye locked on Trump. For a moment, he didn't move. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as if the world had paused to watch. Then he leaned back, his eyes narrowing to slits, and repeated her phrase in a voice so low it rumbled through the floor. "Trading up?" Another chuckle, darker this time, cut the tension like a knife. "You want to talk about value, Jessica? Since that's all you seem to understand, let's do it. In business, yeah, sometimes you trade up. Better deal, shinier building, bigger profit. But we're not talking about real estate here. We're talking about my wife, my partner, the mother of my son. Real value isn't a newer model or a flashier face. Real value is loyalty, strength, someone who's there when the lights go out and the cameras stop rolling. The audience erupted, claps and cheers swelling into a roar. Jessica's face paled, her cards trembling in her hands, but Trump wasn't done. He leaned forward again, his voice rising to a commanding pitch. You think I'd trade that? For what, some Hollywood fling? Let me tell you what Melania is. Irreplaceable. She speaks 5 languages, I've said it, but it's worth repeating. She's built her own success, stood by me through every hit, every lie your kind's thrown at us. She's not just beautiful, though she is, inside and out. She's brilliant, tough, a rock. You don't trade up from that. You treasure it, but I get it, your world doesn't see that. You think everything's disposable: marriages, commitments, values. That's why your ratings are tanking. The crowd roared again, some standing, others shouting approval. Jessica tried to cut in, her voice shaky. Mr. Trump, I'm just asking what people wonder. But he raised a hand, silencing her with a gesture. No, you're not asking. You're attacking cheap, lazy, and obvious. You wanted a gotcha moment. Thought you'd embarrass me by dragging Melania into this. But here's what you didn't expect. You've embarrassed yourself. You've shown 10 million people watching right now that you don't get real relationships. You don't get real strength. And you sure as hell don't get what makes America tick. Peter yanked off his headset backstage, slamming it onto the console as the control room erupted in chaos. Cut to commercial. He barked, but the director shook his head. No one dared interrupt now. Jessica's smile was gone, her eyes wide with panic as the audience's applause drowned her out. Trump leaned back, folding his arms, his gaze piercing through her. You wanted a trap, he said, his voice dropping to a growl that carried over the noise. But you walked into mine. America's watching, Jessica, and they're not clapping for you. The studio shook with cheers, a standing ovation rippling from front to back. Jessica sat frozen, her career unraveling live on air, while Trump held the stage, unshaken, triumphant. The red on-air light blinked furiously, but the damage was done. This wasn't just a moment. It was a reckoning. The Global News Network studio vibrated with the echoes of applause, a tidal wave of sound that crashed over Jessica Hart as she sat, stunned, in her chair. The audience was on its feet, some clapping with fervor, others shouting affirmations like, "That's right," and "Tell her, Trump." The red, on-air light glared relentlessly, a silent witness to the chaos unfolding live on March 8, 2023. Jessica's note cards lay scattered on the desk, her hands gripping the edges as if anchoring herself against the storm she'd unleashed. Backstage, Peter slumped in his chair, his headset dangling uselessly around his neck, muttering, "We're screwed," to a shell-shocked director who could only nod. Donald Trump, meanwhile, sat back with a calm that bordered on smug, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on Jessica like a chess master watching an opponent concede defeat. Jessica's lips parted, her voice trembling as she tried to salvage the wreckage. "Mr. Trump," she began, forcing a brittle smile. I didn't mean to suggest anything disrespectful about Melania. I was just asking what some people might wonder." Her words stumbled, weak and unconvincing, drowned by a fresh swell of boos from the crowd. Trump raised a hand, a simple gesture that silenced the room as effectively as a gavel. "Oh, you meant it," he said, his voice low but cutting, each syllable a nail in her coffin. "Don't backtrack now, Jessica. You said what you said, trading up, right? You thought you'd throw that out there, make me squirm, maybe get a clip for your highlight reel. But here's the thing. America saw it. 10 million people saw exactly what you tried to do. He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting from accusation to authority, addressing not just her, but the cameras beyond. They saw you attack my wife, not just Melania, but what she stands for. Loyalty, partnership, real strength. And they saw me defend her because that's what real men do. You didn't just lose this little game of yours. You showed the country what's wrong with your kind of media. Cheap shots, fake smiles, tearing down what people build together. That's not journalism. That's a circus. The audience murmured in agreement, a few clapping again, their approval a lifeline Trump seized with relish. Jessica's face flushed, her eyes darting to the control booth for rescue, but none came. Peter's frantic signals had stopped. The director just stared at the monitors, resigned to the train wreck. She tried again, her voice thin. I think we've gotten off track here. Let's... Trump cut her off, his hands slicing the air. No, we're right on track. You wanted to talk about family values? Let's do it. Here's what they are. Standing by your spouse through thick and thin. Building something real decades, not headlines. Melania and I, we've got that. Storms, attacks, your network's lies. We've faced it all, and we're stronger for it. That's what makes America great. Not your shallow traps, but the deep bonds people fight for. His words hung heavy, a sermon delivered with the cadence of a rally speech, and the crowd ate it up. A gray-haired man in the third row whispered to his wife, "That's a man who gets it," while a young woman in a blazer wiped a tear, nodding silently. Jessica's shoulders slumped, her career flashing before her eyes. Every accolade, every viral moment, now ash in the wake of this misstep. Trump turned to the camera, his voice softening but resolute. To everyone watching at home, you know this. You've built lives with your partners, 20, 30, 40 years. You don't trade that for some shiny new thing. You treasure it. That's the America I know, not the one she's selling. The applause returned, steady and warm, as Jessica sat mute, her defeat broadcast live to millions. Trump leaned back, his point made, his victory sealed. Backstage, Peter buried his face in his hands. The control room, a graveyard of shattered plans. The segment ended not with Jessica's triumphant close, but with a hurried cut to commercial, the screen fading to black as Trump's words lingered. The trap had sprung, but it had caught the wrong prey. Days after the March 8, 2023, showdown on Global News Network, the fallout was seismic. Clips of Trump's fiery defense of Melania racked up over 25 million views online within 48 hours. Hashtags like hashtag Trump stands strong and hashtag real values trending across Twitter. Comment sections overflowed with praise. Finally, someone who gets it, wrote one user. Jessica got schooled, said another. GNN's ratings plummeted as viewers abandoned Jessica Hart's show, her once vaunted career, now a cautionary tale. The network quietly demoted her to a weekend slot, her gotcha legacy buried under the weight of Trump's triumph. Trump, ever the showman, seized the moment. At a rally in Ohio a week later, he grinned at the crowd. They tried to trap me, bad idea. I showed him what real family's about. Melania, silent as ever, stood beside him at Mar-a-Lago, her poised presence a quiet testament to their bond. The public saw her anew not a shadow, but a pillar. The interview became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that loyalty could outshine media spin. As spring turned to summer, Trump's words echoed on. You don't trade up, you stand strong. For America, it was a lesson etched in primetime gold.